What's going on, guys? It's Greg here, aka NYPrepper. In this video, I'm going to be shooting my 338 Lapua at some framing lumber. What I've done is I've cut some 2x10s to about 1 foot lengths, and I've screwed them all together. And I want to see how many of those 2x10 boards I can penetrate through with different types of ammo for my 338 Lapua. I'm going to be using some hand loads and a factory load. And the rifle I'm going to be using for this test is my CZ550 Custom. This is a CZ550 receiver, and I have a 26-inch barrel from K&P Barrels. I'm going to be using my Silencer Co. Hybrid 46 suppressor during this test. And I have a Bell & Carlson stock with an aluminum bed block. And I have this Navratl Arms solid steel bolt knob, Athlon scope, and an Atlas bipod. And I have this really cool grippy tape that I added to my stock here. This is made by Hogue. It's actually not a tape, but it's like a sticky panel, and you use heat so it sticks to the stock. This really helps a lot, especially if you have like a Kevlar stock like this one, so it's slippery. Highly recommend it. And I have some New England Custom Guns iron sights. Pretty cool for a 338 Lapua. Had my gunsmith put those on. So the ammo I'm going to be shooting at this lumber is some hand loads like I mentioned and factory loads. So here I have a 300 grain Accubond that I've hand loaded to 2,950 feet per second, and that's generating a muzzle energy of right around 5,900 foot-pounds. Here I have a 260 grain tungsten core AP bullet that I've hand loaded to right around 3,200 feet per second, and that's going to generate right around 5,900 foot-pounds as well. And this one's really cool. This is the factory load. This is made by HSM, and this is a 250 grain banded solid. It's a brass solid with a round nose. This is something you'd see on a dangerous game rifle, and this has a muzzle velocity of right around 2,875 feet per second, and that's going to generate right around 4,600 foot-pounds. And then here I have a 280 grain Barnes LRX that I've hand loaded to 3,075 feet per second, and that's going to generate right around 5,900 foot-pounds. So we're going to shoot these 4 rounds at some framing lumber that I've screwed together. Okay, 2x10 framing lumber screwed together. I think I've got like 30 pieces or more screwed together, and we're going to see how many of those 2x10 boards these rounds will penetrate through. I'm really curious to see how that banded solid will do. I'm sure it's going to penetrate the most out of all of these. I'm also really curious to see how the tungsten core will do, because that's an armor-piercing bullet, and I'm curious if it'll out-penetrate the others because it has a tungsten core, or if that's not really going to matter much. So let's see what happens, guys. Let's start shooting. 338 Lapua versus 2x10 lumber. First shot's going to be with the tungsten core, second shot LRX, third shot Accubond, and then the last shot will be the brass solid. LRX. All right, guys, so I wanted to go over the results with you. So here's our wood. Here's board number 1. You see the 300 grain Accubond in the top right, the 250 grain brass solid top left, 260 grain armor piercing bottom left, and 280 grain LRX bottom right. So here's the first board. You can see the Accubond and the LRX, much bigger holes than the armor piercing and the brass solid, but that's to be expected. But what's really impressive is even in just the first board, the amount of expansion here. Okay, this is just the first board. Look at the expansion there, okay? You already have probably 0.4 inches of expansion with this Accubond, and the LRX probably 0.3 or so inches of expansion. So that is really impressive. Okay, so really good expansion even just in the first board. Now look at this, guys. Second board. Look at the size of that hole. I can almost put my index finger right into that hole. Look at that. That's from the Accubond. And then here's the LRX. A little bit smaller hole, but still pretty impressive for just the second board. Wow, look at that, guys. That is just really impressive. So these bullets are expanding really rapidly. Look at that huge hole. And then there's the LRX. There's the armor piercing. And then there's the brass solid. Here's the back. Look at this, guys. Wow. There's the back of the 300 grain Accubond. This is just in the second board. Look at my thumb, guys. I got big hands. I'm a big dude. You know, that's probably the size of a 12 gauge slug hole. I'm not even kidding. That's like 3/4 of an inch in diameter right there. And that's just in the second board. And then here's the LRX. Look at the size of that hole. That is just super impressive. There's the armor piercing and there's the brass solid. Wow. And this hole you can ignore. That's from my 300 rum separate video, separate test. We're going to be posting that shortly. And then here's the third board. Wow. Look at the Accubond. That is insane. I can fit my whole thumb in there. Look at that. That is totally insane. That's like a 1-inch diameter hole right there, just in the third board. And then here's the 280 grain LRX. I can fit my index finger easily and part of my thumb. Okay. So I know what gun I'm going to take for Alaskan bear hunting. It's going to be this 338. This is really, really impressive. Okay. Massive hole. That's a bigger hole than my 416 Ruger makes with 400 grain soft points. Okay, here's the brass solid, and then there's the armor piercing. And then back of the third board, check it out. Massive exit holes here from the 300 grain Accubond. Just absolutely insane. Look at that. Could you imagine taking that bullet? I mean, that is just complete destruction of anything soft. All right, look at that. LRX hole is also massive as well. There's the Accubond, or I'm sorry, there's the armor piercing, and then there's the brass solid still going through. We're on the fourth board now, and can't really pick this one up. It's split here, okay, but look at the size of these holes. Here's my thumb. All right, this hole is just gargantuan. I mean, that's probably 1.25 inches by now, okay? Just totally insane. It dwarfs my thumb. Look at that. All right. Here's the brass solid, armor piercing, and LRX. The LRX and Accubond look pretty similar as far as the size of the hole. Looks like the Accubond is slightly bigger hole, but not a huge difference. Not enough to where I would say, well, the Accubond expands a whole lot more. So got to get the Accubond and ditch the LRX. But there's the LRX exit hole. There's the Accubond exit hole. That's just so ridiculous. 1-inch diameter. But very similar performance. I was expecting the Accubond to expand more, but you know, the Accubond is traveling 100 feet per second less than the LRX. So even though the Accubond is jacketed, which in theory means they open easier, than the LRX, which is solid copper, but the LRX is 100 feet per second faster, so that's going to make the LRX have more similar performance. Remember, this is at 25 yards, okay? So very, very impressive. That's the 4th board. Here we're on the 5th board now. Massive hole. Look at that. Still going through, penetrating in a straight line still. There's the 300 grain Accubond hole. Absolutely insane. Here's the LRX hole. It's just filled with debris. Here's the armor piercing, and then the tungsten core, and then here's the brass solid. I'm going to see if I can't get some of this out of there so you can see better the size of the hole. Well, I couldn't get all that stuff out of there, but you can see it's a huge hole. LRX, Accubond, brass solid, tungsten core. Huge holes, okay? Massive. This is the 5th board now. We're going into the 6th board. Here you can see the 300 grain Accubond. Still going strong, still a big hole there. Here's the LRX hole. You can see some material from the plastic nose, but still a massive hole there. Okay, massive hole there as well. Here's the solid and tungsten core. So let's continue. So back of the 6th board, here's our 300 grain Accubond. Here's our LRX. And I think this is our armor piercing right there. The tungsten core and then the brass solid. Very interesting. And then here we have the 7th board. You can see the LRX hole still big. The Accubond hole is starting to get smaller now, so that's pretty interesting. Look, this Accubond hole is smaller now. As we penetrate deeper through the wood, the LRX is now outperforming the Accubond, which makes sense because jacketed bullets, they dump all their energy in the initial penetration, and then they lose jacket material and core material, and they start to slow down a lot faster, and they don't hold together as good. Even bonded bullets will still lose material because they're made of lead and copper versus solid copper. They continue to penetrate and maintain their expansion. And then here we have the tungsten core. Look what happened here. It looks like the tungsten core jacket started to basically have a failure because as it's penetrating, it's soft, it's copper and lead over the tungsten. So there it is right there. And then here we have the brass solid still going through like a laser. Absolutely insane. And then here we have the back of the 7th board. There's the tungsten core, LRX, Accubond, and solid. And here we have the 8th board. Looks like our LRX got stuck in the 8th board there. Here's our Accubond. Here's our solid still going through. Here's our tungsten core. Looks like it still went through. So the LRX surprisingly got stopped by the 8th board, penetrated through 7 boards. That is just massive penetration and just leaving a huge hole. Massive hole, massive energy dump, but it got stuck in the 8th board, penetrating through 7, the LRX 280 grain, 3,100 feet per second. There's the Accubond still going through, and tungsten core appears to still have gone through as well. Here's the back of the 8th board. Looks like our Accubond might be stuck also in the 8th board. Yeah. So there's the Accubond. So the Accubond and the LRX had the same amount of penetration going through 8 boards, or actually getting stuck in the 8th board, penetrating through 7 boards, but just massive entrance and exit holes, massive expansion. That's similar penetration to my 500 Smith & Wesson Magnum with hard cast bullets, 440 grain hard casts or 400 grain solids, copper solids. That's the same amount of penetration roughly. Those can go through like 8 to 10. And here we have 7. Okay, so pretty impressive. And then here we have the 9th board. You can see the solid still going through. Here's just a little dent from that Accubond. Looks like maybe some of the bullet is in there as well. We'll have to take a look at that. Okay, but there's the 9th board. Here's the tungsten core still going through. And then here's the back of the 9th board. The tungsten core still going through. Very impressive. And then here we have the solid still going through. And then here we have the 10th board. Tungsten core still going through. Solid still going through. All right, guys, so here we have the 11th board. You can see the solid still going through. There's the tungsten core. Here we have the back of the 11th board. You can see the tungsten core still going through and the solid still going through. Here we have the 12th board. Solid still going through. Looks like the tungsten core still going through. And then here we have the back of the 12th board. Tungsten core did not go through the 12th board. Looks like it's stuck in there, so we're going to pull that out. We'll also pull the Accubond and the LRX out. We're going to weigh them, see what kind of expansion we got, what kind of weight retention. Here's the 250 grain solid, back of the 12th board. Here we have the 13th board, 250 grain solid, still going strong. Here we have the 14th board, 250 grain solid, still going strong. 15th board. 16th board, 17th board, 18th board, 19th board, just above the knot there, just barely made it above the knot. Here's the 20th board, 21st board, and it looks like it's stuck between the 21st and the 22nd. So we got to physically separate these. Let me do that. So here's the 21st board. We separated them. And there you can see that 250 grain brass solid, not even a scratch on it. Look at that thing. Pretty much most of the way through, probably about halfway through. So, technically it would be 20 boards. Penetrated through 20 boards. So pretty impressive. But I'm going to say 21 because it's like almost out this one. So we'll say 21 or 20. So I'm going to pull this one out. I'm going to pull the tungsten core out, the LRX and the Accubond. And let's weigh them and see what kind of weight retention and also see what kind of expansion we got. Just wanted to show you what that tungsten core did. It ended up getting stuck backwards and sort of on an angle in the 12th board. So 11 boards for the 260 grain tungsten core. Looks like it's mostly intact. The tungsten core did not leave the jacket. Looks like 20 to 21 boards for the brass solid and 7 boards for the Accubond and the LRX. All right, guys, so here's our bullets. Here we have the 300 grain Accubond. Not much of it left. Expanded quite a bit. Look at that. Massive expansion, but not much of it left. Bet we won't have good weight retention. Probably like 70%, I think. Here we have the LRX. Wow, look at that. That is insane. Can't wait to measure the expansion on that one. Massive expansion. Again, this is at 25 yards. Probably hitting the wood at 3,050 feet per second or 3,075 feet per second. So that's a lot of velocity. But massive expansion there. And then here we have the tungsten core. Looks like the tungsten is still in there. Basically, it looks like the whole bullet was like bent in half because you can see, looks like the nose there. That looks like the nose. And this looks like it could be the base. I don't know. No. That looks like the base right there. And then there's the the nose. I'm betting that the tungsten is still in there somewhere. And then here we have the 250 grain solid. You can see the rifling marks right there. If you guys shoot a lot of brass bullets, make sure you clean your barrels because you will get brass deposits in your barrel. And brass is hard on barrels because brass is harder than copper and lead, so it's going to wear your barrel out faster. So just keep that in mind. But still intact. So let's start weighing these. Here's our 300 grain Accubond, 3,000 feet per second. Penetrated through 8 boards actually. Wow, only 210 grains. So that's not good. Looks like it lost quite a bit of weight. Looks like about 30% weight loss, so about 70% weight retention roughly. And look at the difference with the LRX, exactly 280 grains, so it retained 100% of its weight. Very impressive. Here we have the 260 grain tungsten core. Didn't lose that much, only 205 grains, so lost about 55 grains out of 260. That's not so bad. And then here's our 250 grain brass solid, Barnes banded solid. The famous, the legendary, the illegal now. 100% weight retention. So the 300 grain Accubond retains 70% of its weight. And this one penetrated through 8 boards. The LRX retained 100% of its weight, penetrated through 7 boards. The tungsten core retained 78% of its weight, and I think the tungsten penetrator is still in there. And then the solid penetrated through 20 to 21 boards, retained 100% of its weight, and then the 260 grain tungsten core made it through 11 to 12 boards. So the tungsten core didn't really help out too much with penetration because of the jacket material around that tungsten penetrator. The tungsten penetrator is very small. It's like a little nail, and it's embedded inside of the bullet, and it's surrounded by lead and copper, so the penetrator was still inside of this bullet when it was penetrating through all those boards. So let's do some expansion measurements now. All right, guys, so the 300 grain Accubond at its widest point, 0.785 inches. And then if we look at the narrower side, about 0.54 inches for the 300 grain Accubond. 280 grain LRX, about 0.7 inches at its widest point. And then at the narrower side, 0.583 inches. So that is just massive expansion, guys. Massive. That's like a 12 gauge slug with this 280 grain LRX. But that's pretty much it for this one, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. So once again, the 280 grain Barnes LRX, 338 Lapua Magnum, 3,100 feet per second, penetrated through 7 2x10 Douglas fir boards. The 300 grain Accubond at 3,000 feet per second, penetrated through 8 boards. 260 grain tungsten core armor piercing, went through 11 to 12 boards. And then the 250 grain solid went through 20 to 21 boards. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Check out my 338 Lapua playlist for all of my 338 Lapua videos. And until the next time, take care, God bless, and don't forget the 3 Ps. Prepare, practice, and persevere.